Okay, now you wrestle with the question, like, why didn't God heal him? In fact, why did he get this cancer in the first place? And you have kind of a distinct perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Will you tell us just a little bit about the theology you bring
Yeah.
to Lord Willing, and how that maybe differs from a kind of standard theology
Yeah.
that people... I know that when mothers lose loved ones, they get a lot of grief literature that will say things like, trust God's
Yes.
will, that God's timing is always the right timing,
Right.
and things like that.
Right.
How is your perspective maybe different from that?
Well, my perspective changed about 2 years before Henry died. So I was raised in a very conservative Christian home and community. And I became a Christian at 6 years old, and I was baptized not long after that. And so I had a lot of beautiful experiences of God's love while I was growing up. But I also went into adulthood with very different pictures of what God was like and what Jesus was like.
Yeah.
So Jesus I liked.
Right.
And God I wasn't so sure
There's
about.
a strand of church history. It's all about that. Martin Luther, the
Yeah.
reformer, had the same thing. He loved Jesus.
Yeah.
God the Father terrified him.
And you see it everywhere. When you start sort of looking for it, you can see it everywhere. But that's the view that I had. And so then in my early 30s, late 20s, we started having children. I started listening to podcast sermons because I was up all night. And so I might as well use that time constructively and learn something. Yeah, right? No sleeping at night. But that's when I realized, as I listened to a couple of different preachers, that there are Christians, and I didn't know this for most of my life, that love God, that love Scripture, and have completely different pictures of what God is like and what God's role is in suffering. And so I was listening to one pastor at the time that holds what I talk about in the book, the blueprint worldview, which is the belief that history is a working out of God's meticulous divine blueprint, and that there's a mysterious higher good behind anything that comes to pass. And so I was listening to this pastor, and then I was listening to another pastor who holds the warfare worldview. And the warfare worldview is based first and foremost on God being completely revealed in the person of Jesus, and most poignantly on the love of the cross. And the warfare worldview holds that God's will is not the only will that determines what comes to pass. There's a multiplicity of wills that affect what happens, and that all evil ultimately originates in wills other than God. So those are very different worldviews, very different pictures of God that play out in a different way. And so I began to wrestle with my picture of God for a couple of years, and the warfare worldview sounded really good. It just sounded too good for me because I had been raised in this blueprint mentality, and it was scary to think that God was really as loving as the love poured out on the cross, that was really the full representation of God. But coming across Hebrews 1:3 made it kind of hard to argue with that, which Hebrews 1:3, Jesus, it says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, He's spoken to us by His Son, who's the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being. Yeah, and so that wasn't, like, for me, I checked my Bible every day. Like, is that still there? Because that wasn't a suggestion. That wasn't even permission. That was an instruction to view Jesus as the exact representation of God. And so I sort of started to lock that in. Like, is this preacher onto something? Is this something I really need to wrestle with? And then it's like popping up all over the place. New verses that I'm seeing in a new way. So Colossians 1, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Colossians 2, in Christ all the fullness of deity lives in bodily form. And John 14, and this never stood out to me before.
But you see the Father.
Yeah, Philip says, show us the Father. Jesus says, you see me, you've seen the Father. Well, that makes sense now, So anyway, by the time we got Henry's diagnosis, by the time Henry died, I had spent a few years wrestling with my picture of God. And I had really rejected this blueprint notion that everything happens according to God's perfect plan. And I had embraced that God is always battling to do the most good possible within the constraints of the world that He created. And it made a huge difference. Because as I was losing Henry, I could fall into the arms of a God that I could trust. We were on the same side. We were doing John 10:10 together. We were battling for life to the full. And I wasn't chalking up to God someone who steals, kills, and destroys human life. I was partnering with God.
It's amazing how so often that gets true to God. He's the one who killed, who stole, who destroyed.
And I think
Jesus,
the bulk
that's
of
Satan.
The bulk of the grief literature says, that God knows what He's doing and this happens for a purpose. And this book doesn't do that. This book says if it's bringing life to the full, then it's a reflection of the God revealed in Jesus. If it steals, kills, and destroys, we can chalk that up to wills other than God.
Okay, then that's really good, by the way.
Thank you.
But there are people who get the comfort
Yeah.
in the idea, and I just wonder if people are wired differently. But
Sure.
it scares them to think
Yeah.
that things happen that are outside of God's will.
Yeah.
If God's the one who's in charge of all this, and I mean by that meticulously calling the shots, or at least has a good reason for allowing everything He does. If that's not the case, then maybe Henry's death could be fortuitous, or it has no
Right.
point. There's no
Right.
meaning to it.
Yeah.
And if this is all part of a plan, and if you can bring yourself to believe that God's good, even though this part of the plan sucks, then it gives them kind of a comfort.
Sure.
It fits into a bigger narrative. So what do you do for people who freak out with the idea that God's not controlling things? It might have been God's will in fact, in your view, it was God's will for Henry to live, but God's will got thwarted.
Right.
And that freaks them out.
Yeah. I think there's 2 points there. One speaks to safety and security, and one speaks to purpose. So
Okay.
as far as it comes to people losing a sense of safety or security, I was in that camp at first. I thought, well, gosh, if God doesn't always unilaterally get His way, I feel like I'm exposed. I'm more vulnerable. But I don't think I had ever really thought through the implications of the theology that I held about God. Because if God had unilaterally gotten His way from the foundations of time, then we're talking about a God whose character specifically allowed the Holocaust, every rape, every kidnapping, every brain tumor. This is the character of the God that I'm expecting to protect me. That doesn't really line up, because if all of those things were part of His plan, then my destruction could surely be part of His plan.
Yeah. Trust the wolf; he won't eat you.
Right.
He might eat all the other ones, but
but not you.
You're safe.
Yeah.
How many other people were told that and then got eaten by the wolf?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think people think, okay, my only option is this is happening according to God's plan, or God's completely unprepared. He has no plan. But I think when we look at a God of infinite intelligence, rather than saying there's one plan or God's completely unprepared, we say, okay, you could have a view where there's one plan, or there's a view where God of infinite intelligence has a trillion plans, that no matter what happens, no matter what decisions are made or whatever freak thing happens, there's a plan in place to deal with that, because for a God of infinite intelligence, a trillion plans are no more taxing mentally than one plan. And if only one plan actually plays out in the actual world, then we could say that in this view, God overknows the future. He's overly prepared for whatever comes to pass. And that brings, I think, a big source of security. And I think as far as purpose goes, we're used to saying, well, if it's not preceded by purpose, then it's meaningless. But I don't think that Henry's death happened for a divine purpose. But the beautiful thing with a God of infinite intelligence and wisdom and creativity is I see God meet this pain with purpose at every turn. I was telling the story to someone the other day about how I was having a really rough night. It's back to school time, and people are buying backpacks and pencil boxes, and Ninja Turtle stuff is out, and I wonder what my little boy would be into if I could send him back to school right now. And I want to mother him through another tragedy, through another transition, and I can't. And I was having a really hard night, and just pouring out my heart in prayer, pouring out my heart to my husband, and it was just a bad night. And in the morning, I had several different contacts through social media, tweets and messages from people I hadn't met yet, or people that I knew casually, that said, I'm just encountering your story for the first time, and man, it's bringing me closer to God. Oh, this is impacting me. Or I gave your book to someone who needs it. You should have seen the look on her face. And I thought, God's bringing purpose to this at every turn. I don't think it was planned for a purpose, but it's not meaningless.
I think what happens, a lot of people, because we have trouble conceiving of infinite intelligence, and we tend to limit God's smartness, that they often will see good that God brought out of evil, and then they assume, well, that means that God must have ordained the evil for that good.
Right.
But you're saying that, no, He's got contingency plans that are as effective as if He would have foreknown just that one thing as a certainty from the foundation of the world.
Well, if you have infinite intelligence, you can foreknow any possibility as clearly as if it were a settled fact.
That's it, yeah.
And it's like, for me, if I have plans on Friday night, maybe I could do a play date, maybe I could go to a movie with my husband. And I really 3 or 4 contingency plans, and I'm maxed out. Like I'm done. I got nothing else to give. But God can have a trillion plans for how Friday night's going to go, depending on the free choices of free agents, and enact any of those as effortlessly as if there had only been one plan.
Okay, but some will hear this and they might be thinking, look at, you have a God who He's always responding, so okay, fine. He's got bases covered, but he's not very strong. I mean, he's not omnipotent. Are you denying the omnipotence and the sovereignty of God?
Oh, yeah, a couple of questions there. I think that when it comes to the warfare worldview, omnipotence, God being all-powerful, is defined as in God being the source from whom all power originates. And some scholars will say, well, but if he doesn't always unilaterally get his way, then God has been weakened or lessened. But other scholars, like C.S. Lewis, have said that God's creation of free agents who can reject him, or in other words, can reject his, thwart his will, is a miracle and the most astonishing of all the feats that we attribute to God.
Christianity. God's greatest feat of omnipotence is creating creatures who can say no to him.
Yeah, because if we look at I think it's 1 Corinthians 1, if we look at how God operates, we look at the wisdom and the power of God is in the cross.
That's right, yeah.
It looks different, the sovereignty of God. A lot of people equate it with meticulous control. And they say God is meticulously controlling everything because he's sovereign. But if that's our definition of sovereignty, we've ruled out the possibility of love. Because love has to be freely chosen. It can't be coerced. 1 Corinthians 13 says love does not insist on its own way. So we have to have the freedom to reject love. We have to have the freedom to thwart the will of God in that way. And so I think rather than saying that God unilaterally gets his way and then we say, well, how does the sovereign God love? I think we look at the God revealed in Jesus and we say, how does this God of perfect love express his sovereignty? And I think that's where we go back to the transformative love of the cross.
Yeah, perfect. I've just been re-amazed, because I've been amazed before, but I've just been recently re-amazed at 1 Corinthians 1:18 and 24, where Paul says, to the world, the cross is weakness and foolishness, but to us it is the wisdom and the power of God.
Right.
And I mean, that just blows sky high every conception of God that humans have ever had. We know exactly what gods look like when humans make them. We have a history examples, and they all look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, running on a cloud. The muscle god, I get my way. Because that's the kind of power that humans always see. But here Paul says the exact opposite. This is one of the ways this is divine inspiration, because human beings don't make this stuff up.
Right.
It's so radical, I don't think the majority of Christians throughout history have believed it. Because when we talk about God's power, they revert to an Arnold Schwarzenegger model. But here it's the cross, the ability, self-sacrificial love, the pouring out, that's the power of God. That's how and the resurrection shows that's how he wins in the end.
Yeah, that love can't be stamped out with brute force, that it's always ultimately victorious.
Well, now, some might go so far as go with you and say, okay, I get why I had to give humans free will. But a human didn't cause this cancer.
Right. We put that in the category of natural evil. And so when it comes to natural evil, then I like to ask myself two questions, or I'd like to think about 2 points, which is if we base our picture of God on the person of Jesus Christ, we have to first and foremost ask ourselves, what was Jesus' response to natural evil? And when we look at the sicknesses and the diseases and the deaths that Jesus healed and or rebuked, we see these are a natural part of nature. Like Mark 9, Jesus rebukes a storm when he's out on the boat with his disciples. He doesn't rebuke all storms on the planet. Not all storms are inherently evil, but this one was a threat to human life, made in the image of God. And so when Jesus rebukes that storm, I think he reveals the heart of the Father toward natural evil. And I think that brings me to my second point, which is that when it comes to radical suffering and evil, whether it's from moral evil or natural evil, we can always attribute that to wills other than God. And I think most people get that when it comes to moral evil, like choosing to steal. We say, well, God willed the possibility, not the actuality. He gave you the freedom to steal. He didn't will that you steal. Right. But I think that, so also when it comes to natural evil, God willed the possibility that there would be natural evil, but not the actuality.
What causes the natural evil?
I think, well, one explanation is to look at intrinsic necessities. So we look at when it comes to certain cancers, or when it comes to even like water, we need, C.S. Lewis called these intrinsic necessities. We need water in order to survive, but that water that's dense enough to quench our thirst can also cause us to drown. Same thing with fire, warms our hands and cooks our food, but it can bring our buildings and our bodies to ash. And the same thing that processes that help humans in the long run can sometimes create things that are harmful. But I think that it's part of living in an environment with dynamic, free processes that are necessary to sustain biological life, that can choose love or reject love, but that contains certain risks. So I think God willed the possibility, but not the actuality. He gave us the freedom to steal. He doesn't will that we steal. He gives us the possibility of biological life, but he doesn't want a tumor or a tornado to kill someone.
I thought there was two parts to that answer.
That's one explanation,
yeah.
is to really appeal to those intrinsic necessities.
Right,
And then
right.
certainly there's another explanation where we appeal to fallen powers and how the earth was created one way in God's design and it's been thwarted. And now we live on the front lines of the war zone. The warfare worldview talks about 4 words: love, risk, rejection, and war. And about how the God of love created from love to expand his love. But in doing that, he took a risk. He took a risk that his love could be rejected. And the Bible talks about rejection in the human realm and the angelic realm. And
Yeah, it does. And that's not just like a minor point. Throughout the Bible, you find the belief in supernatural beings is
Right.
woven into the very fabric of the biblical narrative. And Jesus' ministry, the second most common thing he does is cast out demons. And sometimes he diagnoses, in fact, the New Testament uniformly diagnoses sicknesses and diseases as being due to demonic interference. And so, I think what applies to humans about free will and love also applies to the angelic beings. But that's good. That's good.